Please, Dr. Sunic.
Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here. Good evening, everybody. I'd certainly like to extend my greetings to all of you and, of course, to Daniel. I don't see Daniel, but all the best, and I certainly appreciate for what he did for us and for setting up this conference. Also, many thanks to Tobias and all of you. I seem to be, so to speak, a household name here in Stockholm because I've been here on several occasions and I've always been very well welcome, and I hope that our collaboration, our cooperation will continue in the future. Look, I'm going to be talking, just a few technical issues. I'm going to be talking for about a half hour, and then after that I certainly would appreciate if you could ask me critical questions, not flattering questions, but critical questions about some issues that I will be talking about. So the major issue, or should I say the major paradigm, you know, paradigm is like a new fancy word that is very popular in academia, but basically we can translate it into simple English with the word model or simply example. It seems that this new paradigm nowadays has become immigration. So this is like a word, a sacred word, which has been rolling on all wavelengths 24 hours a day. Now, before we address this issue of immigration, I'll try to tie it in with race and culture. In fact, my major argument is that in our modernity, or if you want to call it postmodernity, as Mr. Lars mentioned earlier, it seems to me that race again and culture are two, so to speak, two most visible vehicles, two most visible motors of our new identity. I understand this is quote-unquote a controversial issue with our mainstream media, let alone with our sold-out academics, you know, here in Stockholm or elsewhere in the world. But I guess this issue of race needs to be addressed, of course, in an academic and hopefully scientific fashion as well. Further on, I'm going to be quite critical of liberalism, or let's call it capitalism, and of course, I'm going to make a few critical remarks of Christianity. Hopefully, I'm not going to hurt anybody's feelings here, but I'll try to tie those issues together into a larger whole. And basically what I plan to do now is a little synopsis, half-hour synopsis, and you are aware of the fact that this is a huge topic, and again, without false modesty, I would like to, I would encourage you to look at my books that I've put on display over there. Some of those, especially the book Postmodern Report, which is the collection of some very academic essays, published also in some quote-unquote politically correct journals in a somewhat convoluted language, because what I'm saying here, I'm using a different meta-language from the one I would normally use at some, let's say, Rotary Club meeting, you know. Then I would have to castrate my language to make myself more convincing, if you can follow me on that, all right? So certainly, if you are interested in finding out more about race and culture and religion, I'd suggest you to read the book Postmodern Report. Let's start first with immigration. I would name it, I would call it immigration like identity by default, so to speak. Let's ask ourselves a rhetorical question. Of course, we realize what Europe has been going through over the last 20 years, both the racial and the cultural profile of Sweden, and not just Sweden, but the entire Western Europe. Ironically, not of Eastern Europe, which is more European than Western Europe in a racial sense, has changed so dramatically in such an unprecedented manner to the extent that you can barely call yourself a Swede, a Swedish nationalist. What does that mean if there's 10% of people who are of non-Swedish origin? What does it mean to be American in the United States of America, where 30% of American residents are of non-European, non-white origin? And within 20 years, you'll have about 50% of American residents, whatever that might mean in this near future. And of course, in some areas, you certainly know, in California, New Mexico, Arizona, the white Americans have already in minority. So these are some of the issues we need to clarify. I wonder frequently, why do I have to define myself always by rejecting the other? And this is the problem with identity. You cannot have identity unless you reject, unless you snub the other. And I guess this is also a moral issue and also a conflictual issue. Let me give you an example, and I'll try to be with you as frank as possible. Of course, I grew up in the ex-communist Yugoslavia in a highly nationalist family, very cultivated family, whatever. And even nowadays, when I talk to Croatian nationalists, they're very educated nationalists. They cannot simply conceive of their identity, of nationalist identity, unless they lambast, unless they rave and rant against Serbs. So I wonder, what the heck is going on? Do I have to be an anti-Serb to become a good Croatian nationalist? If you use the same type of analysis, do I have to hate the Muslims in some parts of Stockholm here, or in Copenhagen, or let's say in Frankfurt? There are some parts in Berlin, in Kreuzberg, and so on. Why do I have to hate those guys in order to assert my identity? Can I be myself? Can I be proud of my whiteness, of my origin, of my heritage, without necessarily resenting, or let's say hating, the other? I cannot. I don't know the answer to it. But the fact of the matter is, and I insist on it, old nationalisms in plural, such as we have known them in Europe since the French Revolution, all the way until 45 and even later on, including the last war in the Balkans, we must admit that nationalism in Europe, or nationalisms in plural, I mean nationalism, be it the Swedish nationalism, be it the French nationalism, be it the Catalan, Gallic, Ukrainian nationalism, Serbian nationalism, Albanian nationalism, you name it, whichever way you like, has been harmful. It has been harmful to white cause. It has been harmful to white people. It has been harmful to our heritage. So ironically, let's ask ourselves a rhetorical question. Do we need a solid onslaught of non-European immigrants from different antipodes like Asia, Northern Africa, and so on, in order to coalesce our rank and file, in order to forget and shrug off our tribal quarrels between the Serbs, Croats, between the Flemish and Walloons, between the Catalans and the Gallegos, between the Slovaks and the Hungarians, between Hungarians and Romanians and what have you? Hardly. I will tell you an example because this may interest you. I understand that in Sweden, for instance, my colleagues, my friends, and of course in the United States, this is almost a cataclysmic type of issue. Everybody talks about immigration, Islam, Islamic threat. But then I wonder, look, you move further east, you go to Croatia, you go to Hungary, you've heard of this Jobbik party and so on, and there is so much, imagery, wrong imagery, false perception of this party, and I'm sorry to say that. Most of those peoples in Eastern Europe are much more obsessed with, they're infatuated with their own nation state, with their own sagas, with their own myths. And ironically, all those myths, what? They're at odds with the identity and with the myths of the neighboring white nation. I don't know the answer. But this is something very, very serious and very dangerous for all of us, for our survival. Why is that? Because it gives this inter-white quarrel, if I can put it that way, we're talking about Eastern Europe for a while, gives further legitimacy. It justifies the multicultural, liberal, neo-Marxist experiment, now, whichever way you want to call it. So again, as I said, ironically, this onslaught of non-European immigrants now may, let's say, hopefully be coalesce our rank and file, our peoples, in order to finally shrug off this petty nationalism that has cost us dearly. So I guess we have to be quite open, and I mean, not just academically, but on a civil level, we have to be frank with ourselves. Why do I have to hate the immigrants of different color, of different culture? Well, at the same time, let us not forget it. Since the 30 years war, I'm sorry, since earlier wars and so on, whites have been constantly fighting with each other. The Swedes, during the Civil War, I don't know how many of you know, the Swedes were fighting against the Croats in the Magdeburg region in northern Germany, because the Swedes took the other sides, and the Croats, they were good papists, so they fought with the Reich and so on and so forth. And again, this is something we need to examine, this whole issue of immigration. What does that precisely mean? Well, my answer is quite simply, before we start even criticizing immigration, or for that matter, specific specific outgroups that are coming to this country, like, for instance, Albanians, for instance, or people from Northern Africa and so on, we have to examine the causes of this immigration. And this applies not just to our friends here in Europe, but also to my friends in the United States of America. And I'll tell you quite frankly, I frequently get upset with people in the United States of America, but also here, and I'm not going to mention their names because some of those people are dear to me, but some of them are not very dear to me. They seem to be obsessed with this magic word Islam, Islam, Islam. They think about some Islamic threat and so on, forgetting that there are many Muslims who are white, completely white. I mean, Bosnia and Herzegovina, you have people, you know, who are white Muslims, or they're very secular Muslims, but who look more Nordic than most of you. I can tell you that firsthand, you know. So let's be careful. Let's not make those ad hoc type of judgments. Let's analyze each country within its own context. My major argument is that we need to look at the causes of this immigration, especially over the last 40 years. As you may recall, 40 or 50 years ago, this word, this verbiage, immigration did not even exist, because most nationalists back then, including Swedish nationalists, Hungarian nationalists, what have you, English nationalists, were obsessed with what? Was communism, was a real threat of communism. And of course, the profile of the UK, the profile of Sweden, the profile of the United States of America looked much differently 40 years ago. Who is the culprit? Well, I'll tell you quite openly, let's not use euphemisms. I prefer the word capitalism to the word liberalism. Let's try to enter the mindset of capitalists. Let's try to enter the mindset of, let's say, local entrepreneurs here in Sweden, or for that matter, some local entrepreneurs, big businessmen in the United States of America. My argument is, and I'm basing this on some solid evidence, and I also owe some of my comments here to my friend Alain de Benoit, who actually wrote about this immigration, the reserve labor army of capital. Okay. How does, let's say, a rich man, a very wealthy man, an entrepreneur, let's say, in the United States, or for that matter in Sweden, how does he argue about immigration? He thinks in the following fashion: well, I'm going to facilitate the arrival, or if you wish, the onslaught of those foreign immigrants from third world countries for a couple of reasons. He probably doesn't put it academically, but these are the instincts, those capitalistic instincts that speak through him. So let me try to empathize negatively with that guy, whatever his name may be, Johansson or Johnson or Hansen or whatever. He may think, look, first I'm getting a reserve labor army here, which to start with is welcome. It can fill in some in the job market, some loose spots. It's also the army that is not very intelligent. Let's face it, folks, let's not mince our words. Most of those foreign immigrants from third world countries have a lower IQ, so they are not very, very intelligent. They certainly don't have an IQ of 120 or 110. They're probably in the range of 18, 19, depending on the countries they're coming from. And certainly, one other important thing that we often forget, white nationalists, and I consider myself white nationalist, not in a pejorative fashion, is that most of those people have no class consciousness, not in a Marxist sense, but in our sense. They have no social consciousness. They are not aware. Keep in mind that the workers here in Sweden, in France, in Germany, in the United States of America have put 200 years in building up their consciousness of good versus evil, of bad capitalists versus good workers. I probably sound like Marxist. No, I'm not. I'm just using some of their theories, but I'm talking from a different perspective anyway. I hope you can follow me on that. So those people, let's say, some putative, some hypothetical guy coming from, let's say, Somalia, or coming from, let's say, Eastern Anatolia, or let's say even coming from, or Algeria or Libya now, most likely will be now bracing for the onslaught of Libyan refugees, or quote-unquote refugees. They're coming here for the reasons I've already mentioned you. IQ is somewhat lower. They're more manipulable. They can be used for capitalistic purposes far better. And here comes the point. Given the fact that they have no class consciousness, given the fact that they have no social consciousness, they can be better manipulated, but it facilitates capitalists, be it in Sweden, in Germany, in France, and elsewhere, to exert downward pressure on our wages. In other words, to put it in a simple English, our wages, the wages of black-collar workers in Sweden, or workers for that matter, are becoming lower by the day. I guess I haven't discovered, anything special. I mean, you are very well familiar with the fact that our purchasing power in Sweden, or for that matter in America, it's pretty much chaotic. The middle class is bye-bye, is disappearing. Why is that? Precisely because of the mestizos. 30 million people are already there, illegals. And of course, they put the pressure on those big, rich capitalists. You can probably imagine what those guys look like. Some of them are proud of being whites, but it doesn't prevent them from making a profit. The big guy, whatever his color of the skin may be, he's interested. Let's say in California Valley, there are lots of vineyards, and there are some Croatian Americans there who have big vineyards, And of course, it's much better for them to hire cheap Mexican labor, mestizo labor, and of course mestizo, instead of hiring a white poor guy and pay him $20, per hour. So he pays $2 for this Mexican labor, and that's it. That's good for him. So this is in fact the big problem, because the more immigrants come to this country, the lower our wages and the quality of our life, generally speaking, is becoming, well, it's becoming bad. So if I can sum up this first portion of my lecture, as far as capitalism is concerned, here we have a very short, sort of an irony of history, that the left, the Marxist left, or the post-Marxist left, or whatever they call it, let's call them anti-fascist, that's a new word they've now come up with, anti-fascist left, multicultural left, they've sort of crafted a tacit holy alliance with the big business. The big business wants to dismantle the nation state. Why is that the case? Because the nation state, such as it exists, for instance, in Sweden or in England, still is a welfare state. It pays a huge, it pays a decent amount of money to unemployed workers. So the big business doesn't want to do that. I mean, you can tell me probably better than I, and I'm sure you can probably come up with some good argument, some empirical argument. I would be happy to quote you on that. Those freebies, if I can put it that way, those goodies that, generally speaking, that the government provides now for unemployed people are not as high as they used to be 10 or 20 years ago. And this is precisely of this foreign expendable labor. I mean, this is a very difficult issue, I understand that, so I don't want to go too much into details, but I'm sure we'll have some questions afterwards. So we are the ones, we whites, we are the ones who suffer definitely from that. And I would definitely suggest that the first and foremost issue, the first and foremost goal on our part, before we're starting criticizing Muslims or Pakistanis or Indians or whoever they may be, Martians, whoever, let's first attack. Let's first, come to grips with capitalism. Again, as I said, I may sound like Marx, but Marx was quite prophetic, even 150 years ago, when he said that the liberalism or capitalism knows no walls, be it the Berlin Wall or Chinese Wall, everything comes down. And we can see it now in Croatia also, after this experience with communism. Again, I'm not going to now tackle the issue of the leftist mystique and their verbiage. Now, keep in mind one interesting thing in their semantics. I don't know if you have paid attention to it. About 50 years ago, your colleagues, it's a university professor here in Sweden, what did they talk about? They talk about, well, of course, it was full of compassion for white workers in Sweden who are suffering, who are being exploited by the Swedish capitalists and so on. I mean, you can apply exactly the same type of analysis in Germany and France in particular, where you had labor movements like CGT and so on, trade unions and so on. But ironically, they've now replaced their verbiage, the leftists, the post-leftists, it's called the caviar left or the divine left, as the French call them. Now they use the word what? The immigrants. No? So this is the reserve, we can call it substitute proletariat, the ersatz proletariat, for the lingo, for the verbiage that the left in your universities here quite often use. I mean, those people can be beat they can be beaten quite easily and in a very facile fashion. So if they tell you something about Marxism and human rights and so on, just keep asking them, why did you change the rhetoric? Once upon a time you talked about the Swedish workers being quote unquote mistreated by Swedish capitalists. Why did you now opt for some esoteric or some, let's say, exotic type of a worker, a substitute proletariat coming from the Timbuktu or Ouagadougou or whatever, you know? So these are the issues that need to be very seriously considered. I'm not going to attack now the left and their Marxist mystique and what they're talking about. I've written about this quite extensively. I'm sorry if I'm talking too fast. I'm going to slow down. I would suggest to you, and let's try at least, and I hope I'm not going to hurt anybody's feelings. How about the Catholic Church? Who is the biggest provider of safe havens for mestizos, illegal mestizos in the United States of America? We're talking about millions of people who are illegals there. The Catholic Church. What did Pope do last year, when it was 2 years ago, when the Italian Parliament had introduced a bill stipulating the punishment of people without work permit, mostly illegals. And the Pope, you know, in Osservatore Romano, in this famous Catholic journal, you know, he said, no way, they're all our brothers in Jesus Christ. So instead of now raving and ranting and attacking the Jews and the Frankfurt School and what have you, let's start with our own household now. I'm quite critical of the Catholic Church, but of course there are Protestant churches as well that have sort of lapsed into this type of a meek, would-be, how can I call it, false compassion, you see, and those guilt feelings, very guilt feelings that, of course, Nietzsche, my friend Jacobs, he mentioned that Nietzsche also talks about this false slave morality, or slave ethics rather. And I guess if I can make my own suggestions to you, we have to avoid this type of false compassion. Why should I feel compassionate for a guy coming, let's say, from Algeria, regardless of what his background is? He may be a good guy, but I feel just as sorry for a middle-class, you know, white man in Sweden or in America who's looking for a job. Or for that matter, I can give you the numbers of people who have PhDs who can't land a job in the United States of America because of this damn affirmative action. Talking about affirmative action, okay, let's now I will just get a little bit polemical. Now we all, including the Jantelos, Scandinavians, I myself, we are all to some extent victims of those guilt feelings, which to a large extent can be traced back to where? To Christianity, all right? And its secular avatars like liberalism, you know, always have to be, you have to feel guilty because you're white. You have to be held guilty because of some quote-unquote colonial past. Sweden didn't have any colonial past, neither did Germany have. They had a little bit of Namibia, that was it, you know. Even colonialism, wait a second, okay? I mean, I wonder how many railroad tracks would exist in India without the English, you know, troops. You know, actually put down 40,000 people, put many, many railroad tracks over there. So, yeah, colonialism is bad. It depends who tells you what's bad and what's good. I think that colonialism, by and large, was a good thing. What I detest is this liberal leftist egalitarianism and colonialism, the colonization of your mindset, where they tell everybody, including the guy even who comes from India and France, that he has to accept this theology of human rights, that he has to accept this consumerism, that he has to accept this new type of a mysticism. So do not think that we live in a secular society. We live in a highly theological society. Can you follow me on that? Once upon a time, now we all laugh and wonder how people were burnt because they didn't believe in an immaculate conception of Virgin Mary. But nowadays, if you challenge some of those secular religions, guess how long you're going to last? You may end up in prison. If you challenge the religion of, let's say, multiculturalism or the mysticism of Holocaust and so on, well, you can get into some serious trouble. So we're not going to get into this topic, all right? So basically what I'm telling you, that's my first conclusion, we got to get rid of these guilt feelings, which can largely be traced to this Christian ethics and to the sense of false guilt feelings. Let me just back up for a while where I stopped. You want to see true racism? You want to see true, you know, discrimination? Look, if I talk about from my own experience, it may sound a little bit corny. What's the word? Not horny, but corny. What? It may sound a little bit pathetic, okay? But yes, I did live in Algeria, you know, for 3 years. I lived in India when I was a kid and so on. Well, it was a long time ago, but more recently in Algeria when I was a diplomat and so on. I'll tell you, folks, if you want to really experience what true racism is, go to Mexico. The white class, the movers and shakers in their high diplomacy, they're people of white ancestry. They're not mestizos that you see in over the Rio Grande. And they're very, very conscious, they're very aware of their racial, of their white background. Same thing in Turkey. Have you ever visited Turkey? Argent to me, those fancy places like Bodrum and Antalya and so on. Who runs the show over there in high police and in high diplomacy? People, Turks of European, Bosnian, Albanian ancestry, former slaves, you know, who baptized, who turned to Islam in the 6th and 17th century and so on. So what I'm trying to say, again, keep in mind, many, many nations worldwide, almost all of them, have a very strong sense of racial identity. If they don't, if they are mixtures, if you say, odd mixtures, they know what that means. In traditional societies like Turkey or even elsewhere, they know very well who you are, except for us. We have chosen some role models, okay, some paradigms like Leslie Snipes or Alfred Denzel, whatever, you know, those guys, those black fellows, you know. Well, come with me, I'll take you to the places down south in Compton, you know. You better take good guns with you if you want to survive. Because even if you're white, you're leftist, you will not last there. You will not last. You have to be black. They will not trust you, if you see what I mean. It's just a different country. It's full of explosives. It's full of balkanization. How it will explode, I don't know. We can make some final statements about that. So basically, yes, Christianity is definitely a problem with that, and I'm not going to go now into theology, and sometimes I have a hard time explaining myself, and I don't want to be too apologetic. Yes, I go to church, I'm a Catholic, but for me this is more of a cultural aspect, not so much of a religious aspect. And I have good friends who are Catholics as well, and I talk with them, but in terms of their theology and in terms of their, what do you call it, mythologies, I simply cannot identify with that. I certainly prefer reading Homer, or for that matter, the Iliad, but that's, I guess, it's a private matter. But nonetheless, keep in mind that the Catholic Church, not just in Croatia, but also in France in particular, that's an irony of history. You go places, some folks who are here, who are familiar with France, you will find out that even the Catholic Church in France is, can you imagine, are providing safe havens for illegal Muslim immigrants. It's obnoxious, and it's hard to believe. Now, and then we wonder about the consequences. We saw those ugly consequences with that white trash in Norway that happened recently. That's a real white trash, that guy, you know. Because I wonder why the government, why doesn't it look at it a little bit more specifically at the causes? We recently had wishy-washy statement by Cameron, you know, this prime minister from the UK, and Angela Merkel, you know, she said that liberalismus, das ist total kaputt und so weiter. She said something along those lines. But, you know, it took her 30 years to find out what we have known for such a long period of time. Okay. So this was my criticism of liberalism. This was also my brief criticism of Christianity.